No disclosures. So some quick facts for those who may not be aware. So obviously IDE stands for Investigational Device Exemption. It's indicated for any clinical study in which a drug or a device poses a significant risk or potential for risk or harm to the study subjects or the welfare of the subjects. And a sponsor or an investigator must submit an IDE application to the US FDA for approval, as well as having IRB approval, of course, before initiating a clinical study. An approved IDE actually not only protects human study subjects, but requires study monitoring and allows you to ship the devices for the purposes of the trial. And clinical data collected under the IDE, as we all know, can move towards approval by the FDA, either through the standard pre-market approval process or a 510(k) exemption. IDE studies can be early feasibility studies, as many of us have come to know them, but they can also be pivotal studies, or they can be indication and device expansion studies. EFS studies are characteristically a smaller number of subjects, more animal testing may be appropriate, and a small number of humans is acceptable, and then, of course, the device can often iterate in EFS studies. Looking at pivotal studies, of course, they tend to be much larger, and by then have sort of the final iteration of the device design. But they can also be indication expansion studies, as we've seen with the Reprise 4, Partner 3, the early TAVR trial, and so forth. And so I think it's important to know the different groups of IDE studies out there. They're not just all EFS studies. So the US IDE landscape has changed tremendously in the last few years, and this is in large part because of the success of the FDA EFS Early Feasibility Study program that's now a few years old. But we've really been able to recruit many of these EFS device trials to the US, and that has dramatically changed the landscape of options available to us as investigators and to our patients. And so we're grateful for that, because historically this, of course, was not the case. This slide is just a little canvas of the different valve IDE studies currently ongoing, and I haven't even mentioned novel access technique IDEs like we heard about just now from Adam, or LAA IDEs trials, but just looking at the valves, we have so many different options here in the US, and this would not have been possible without the success of the EFS program through the FDA and other collaborative ways in which the FDA has been working with industry. So why the growth in the landscape? Well, there's several reasons. The EFS program, as I mentioned, and this has been well published and written about by Dr. David Holmes and others. But also, the pre-submission support and guidance from the FDA towards investigators, sponsors, and industry has been tremendous. And the Medical Device Innovation Consortium meetings, which happen on a regular basis, is another forum for investigators, scientists, and industry to collaborate and talk about some of the challenges they're having as they're getting their devices approved or looking at applications to the FDA. There's a lot of enthusiasm and resource allocation from investigators and US-based industry leaders. And then there's a streamlined turnaround time on the approval versus disapproval application within 30 days, which really helps companies to see, okay, what's our issue? Is our testing not up to snuff? Do we need to iterate our device? And they get kind of response and feedback faster so they can move forward faster. Shorter duration EFS studies are also acceptable, which allows us to speed up the pace of study. We can combine outcomes from multiple studies to demonstrate device safety. That's sort of a shortcut that helps things move quicker. As I mentioned, animal testing can be acceptable for EFS, and then breakthrough device designations, which is another important classification that allows for this growth. So this is a schematic from a publication by Dr. Holmes and colleagues from a few years ago, but it really nicely outlines all the key players in the IDE process, and it's really very kind of multifaceted approach, kind of an engine mechanism where it's not just about the science or the investigators or the industry, but so many other resources that go into not just successfully studying these devices, either in EFS or pivotal studies, but then going through the market approval process, and then finally the CMS approval process, which is a completely different issue. So what are the expectations? Well, there's a lot of different expectations. It depends on what the question is. If we're talking about device design, we want, at least in a structural heart sense, we want a transcatheter percutaneous delivery-based device. We want a minimal anatomic footprint. We want minimal vascular access size footprint. We want reproducible and predictable device deployment and implantation. Adaptability to iterate the device is important. As you go through the different EFS studies, if there's an issue with the device, we want the company or the sponsor to be able to iterate quickly to keep moving with the pace of the safety endpoint. So maybe we want too much, I don't know. But what's important to understand is that if we have an EFS study that has a large bore device, not not percutaneous, or maybe it's transapical, and you study it in an EFS setting, and then you have to iterate it and do another study, that slows down the pace. So our expectation is that you iterate your device as much as you can before you go into an EFS study, so that you can then move quickly towards your pivotal, but understand that there may be need for further iterations as well. And we want devices that have the potential for future expansion of indications for use. From a site selection standpoint, it's important for clinical trials to recruit sites that are capable of actually enrolling patients, and this has been very difficult. Sites contracting with their IRBs and having a streamlined approval process is also key, and sometimes it can be a central IRB that can help to do that. Educational and support programs for referring physicians and potential patients, and industry can sometimes help with sites doing that. And then collaborating with not just the investigators and staff at your site, but at other sites to try to figure out what are the issues in patient enrollment and how can we move that pendulum forward. And then, of course, minimizing costs, and a lot of this has to do with the budget for your site, but balancing your budget and knowing where your institution's limitations are a key part of determining whether you can even participate in these kinds of studies. Controversies for future studies. Well, is it really necessary to keep randomizing patients in these larger pivotal IDEs? I mean, if we prove that a transcatheter device is better than surgery for XYZ issue, should future transcatheter valve devices that are in pivotal trials compare to a surgical arm? I think that's an unanswered question. And should we continue to stratify patients based on risk? First we have to do this high-risk trial, then we have to do an intermediate-risk trial, then we have to do a low-risk trial. Is that really going to be necessary as we move forward? And should study protocols be clinically practical to appeal to the specific patients that we're looking at? Because getting FDA approval is very different from CMS approval. And what if you have a device that's not really targeting a Medicare population, but it's targeting a younger population? How would you handle that in terms of what the insurance company is requiring for approval versus what the FDA would require? So that's where randomization comes in, because randomization may not truly be necessary per se for an FDA approval process, but if CMS insists on randomization, it puts pressure on the investigators and on the sponsor to make the pivotal a randomized trial. So these issues really are controversial, but they need to be sorted out. So future challenges, we want to tailor structural heart devices to the needs of the society, and we want rapid iteration. We want equal representation of women and minorities in IDE studies. And that's a challenge not just for IDE, but for large-scale randomized controlled trials as well, of course. Patient access to IDE trial sites and referral pathways continues to be an issue, which is why trial enrollment can be slow oftentimes. FDA approval does not require CMS approval and vice versa, so meaning that the criteria are not the same, there's no overlap, so that can often pose challenges on how you would design an FDA approval study, but that may not necessarily equate to what CMS would approve. Clinical site access to appropriate patient population for enrollment is also key. Oftentimes sites have trials, but they are low enrollers, and so industry investigators have to do more due diligence of figuring out the sites that can truly enroll patients. And then, of course, collaborating with private payers so that they can actually support their patients participating in IDE or EFS studies, which is very important depending on the kind of patient population that the device is targeting. Thank you.